All right. Well, this is training number 5, I believe. Um, yeah, no, I can't believe we're already at number 5. It seems like just yesterday we were having the meetings talking about doing this. And so over the course of a few weeks, we've gone over things like warrant of habitability for tenants, repair and deduct, what it looks like, when you go to court, what happens in court. And so today we're going to be covering inspections. And this is presented by Neighborhood Legal Services, and then PUSH. I'm Angel. I'm the interim housing justice organizer at PUSH, and Amina, our tenant advocate, is on here, and she will be, a little later bit explaining, her job, what she does, and how valuable she is. When more towards the end of the training, and so today we're going to be doing a recap of warrant of habitability. Yeah, we're going to be doing a recap of warrant of habitability, going over different inspection agencies and utility companies, Section 8 inspections, and the different format inspections take, and the different things that you might come across when needing an inspection or seeking one. And then will also be an update on what's happening with the court system, plus with COVID and everything going on.
So just kind of a recap of the earlier trainings. Just want to note that they're all available to watch. If you are watching this, hopefully you got a chance to watch the other ones first. But either way, the warranty of habitability is the guarantee that a home that you're renting in New York State is going to be safe, and there's not going to be conditions that threaten life, health, or safety. It applies to all apartments, even if they're rented in as-in condition. The guarantee doesn't have to be in writing. It covers all homes with or without a lease. So even if you have an informal agreement with your landlord, it is still covered by the warranty of habitability. It could be raised as a defense in an eviction proceeding or as a claim against the landlord, and it does not cover conditions that only make the apartment look bad. Here's a list of just some conditions that are covered. There are more, but these are some of the most common ones. We do go over this in a little bit more detail in our first training, so please check that out if you have not to get some more information. It's a good basis for these later trainings, especially this one. Withholding the rent is another one of the trainings that we put on. It's not the same as not paying the rent. There are specific steps that we would encourage tenants to follow if they do decide to withhold the rent. We have a whole training on it. It's very important that the rent is set aside. That's probably the most important component of it. You should not have the rent spent. If you do and you end up in court, it will be much more difficult to win your case if you have spent the rent. There are certainly risks in withholding the rent. The biggest one is that it may result in an eviction, depending on what happens if it goes to court. Oftentimes, if you do decide to withhold the rent, it's setting up a process that ultimately ends in court more often than not. So something to keep in mind. Repair and deduct is another one of our trainings. This is when a tenant decides to make a repair on their own because the landlord is not doing so. Again, there are certain steps that we would encourage tenants to take. There's a training on repair and deduct that's uploaded as well. It is, kind of a similar response like withholding the rent to a landlord who hasn't been making repairs. There are different things we'd encourage you to do if you decide to do repair and deduct. The biggest one is we often encourage the repair to be done by a professional. There are certain times where it makes sense for a tenant to make the repair themselves, but those are only small repairs. If you are considering doing a larger repair, like fixing a furnace, something of that nature, we definitely recommend involving a professional, a licensed individual to do that work, especially since if something goes wrong, you are far more protected if it goes wrong with a professional doing it as opposed to yourself. It's also less likely to happen. So on to inspections. I'm going to pass it off to Alyssa.
Thanks, Jack. So I'm going to talk just briefly about what tenants should think about before they actually take the step of contacting one of the inspection agencies. Go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So like Jack mentioned, it's possible that a tenant with bad conditions might end up having to prove the conditions in court. And that could happen either if the tenant takes the landlord to court themselves for what's called an affirmative warranty of habitability case, where you would ask the court for a rent abatement or a rent reduction based on the conditions and possibly in order to do repairs. Or it could be a defense. Warranty of habitability can be raised as a defense in a non-payment proceeding. And something like that could happen if you've taken the step of withholding or repairing and deducting from the rent. So if a tenant finds themselves having to prove conditions in court, third-party documentation, like documentation from one of these public health agencies or public agencies, would be good evidence. It can also lead to, like for example, if the Erie County Department of Health does an inspection, they may bring a case against the landlord, and that could lead to a housing violations finding against the landlord. So a lot of times tenants are concerned when they have bad conditions, they might just want to get out, but then they're also concerned about the next person who moves in having to deal with those things. And so reporting it to an agency is one way to make sure that the problem gets addressed. Could you go back one slide, please? Sorry. Thanks. So there's also some risks to think about, particularly if the conditions are a serious threat to health or safety. There is some risk that, for example, if you contact the utility company and they find that your utilities are not safe on, that could result in a shutoff. If an agency comes out to inspect, or if a court hears about seriously unsafe conditions, it could lead to a vacate order. And again, these are serious threats to health and safety. So things like no heat, no water, you know, problems, electrical hazards, fire hazards, things like that. It is important to note that under the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019, there were some changes made to the law with regard to retaliation. So there is now a presumption within 1 year of a tenant making a complaint about conditions. If the landlord tries to evict, the court will presume that the eviction is retaliatory. It's only a presumption though. So then the burden is on the landlord to show that there's a retaliatory reason for the action taken to evict the tenant. And that's generally not a difficult burden to meet. So as long as the landlord's able to give a plausible reason to the court, they may be able to meet that burden. So it's not a complete defense. It can still, even if you believe there's retaliation, it can still lead to, there can still be an eviction. And it's definitely not a good defense if there's been non-payment of rent, because the landlord can easily point to that as the reason for their action to evict the tenant. And just a couple other notes about emergencies and gray areas with inspections. If you do think your condition is something that constitutes an emergency, like a CO leak, you would definitely want to call the fire department right away. You don't want to call the Erie County Department of Health or the Buffalo building inspectors about something that is an urgent need. So just a note about that. And then there are also some things that are considered to be somewhat of gray areas in terms of the warranty of habitability. One of those things is mold. It can be difficult to prove that there's a threat to health or safety, but tenants do have the option to purchase test kits. You can find these if you go online for like $10 or $20, where you can actually take a sample and send it off to be tested. And you can use that as evidence of a threat to health or safety based on mold in your home. Another example is screens. In the city of Buffalo, they're generally not required. But if you have a health issue that's relating to the lack of screens, there might be a way to address it. So if you have any questions about any of these things, you can always feel welcome to contact Neighborhood Legal Services at 847-0650. You can go on to the next slide. Thanks.
So just kind of a brief overview of the different inspection agencies that are in Buffalo and Erie County. There's really two big ones. They're the Buffalo Building Inspectors and the Erie County Health Department. There are other inspectors. If you do live outside of the city of Buffalo, your local municipality will have a building inspector as well. So the Buffalo Building Inspectors, it does break down past just the building inspectors. There's a plumbing inspector, there's an electrical inspector, there's a multiple unit dwelling inspector. There are several different ones. Instead of contacting each one individually, normally you can just contact the building inspector themselves. They're going to deal with more structural problems and code violations. They do deal with other health effects as well. They will look at most things. If they feel like they need to refer something to the Erie County Health Department, they will. Right now with COVID-19, some people have had difficulties with getting them out. It seems to be a case-by-case basis as things have been changing, just like a lot of other responses related to COVID-19. Documentation from the building inspector is different than documentation that you're going to get from the health department. You have to go through a different path. There is open data available on the City of Buffalo website where you can look up building inspector documentation, but that's not something that's going to be extremely up to date. They update that. I think it's about a 3-week delay, if I'm not mistaken. So if you immediately look at it after you have an inspection done, you're not going to have the most up-to-date information. I would still say it is something to look at if you are having issues. The documentation that you're going to want to get if you're getting towards court and you've already called the building inspector is a FOIL request. The City of Buffalo does have a separate FOIL request from the Erie County FOIL request system. It can be confusing. Certainly you can reach out to our office if you need assistance with that. But again, as far as the building inspectors go, they're going to look more at structural problems, code violations, things of that nature. The Erie County Health Department, they're going to deal with infestations and lead. The building inspectors do as well. There's a pretty big overlap. One big thing that a lot of people assume the health department deals with that they actually do not is mold issues. Unfortunately, there's no public agency that's testing mold in homes in Erie County. Neither the building inspector or the health department will do it. Here, there is a link to the FOIL request for Erie County. This is different than the building inspector FOIL request, like I said before. Also, not to be confused with the county clerk FOIL request. It's a maze of different FOIL request avenues. You want to make sure you're requesting it from the right place because it will often take a couple of weeks for them to even review your request and then realize that you sent it to the wrong spot. So you want to make sure that you're sending it to the right place on the first go around so you aren't losing that time getting your reports. They both do kind of, like I said, sometimes work in conjunction, but that doesn't mean that if you call one, there's no reason to call the other. If you call one and they say, that's not something we inspect for as far as an issue that you have, you may want to call the other. So if you have like a specific electrical issue, I would normally say it's better to call the Buffalo building inspectors than it would be to call the health department. But if you are dealing with a large infestation of rodents, it's probably better to call the health department. So it can vary case by case. But if you call one and they aren't looking at what you're talking about, you might want to call the other. And like I said here, lead is another big one that the health department is involved in. And that can be helpful as well because not only do they inspect for lead, they do have a lot of classes for landlords and such about remediating lead and have assistance available for those landlords with remediating lead. That's not something the City of Buffalo does. They'd be referring it out to the health department anyway. So if your primary concern is lead, you may want to call the health department because not only will they inspect it, they will help your landlord remediate it, which is ultimately something that should be done to the unit. with that being said, in our other trainings, we do talk some about the dangers of lead and whether or not you still want to stay in a unit after lead is found, even if the landlord's going to remediate it, is something that you have to make that decision for yourself based on the health needs of you and your family. There are other inspectors out there, like I said. Some ones that we like to note are National Fuel and National Grid. If you're having a specific gas issue or a specific electrical issue, you can contact them. Oftentimes, though, if it's a serious issue, you may have service cut off. They aren't going to go in and fix your hot water tank for you, but they can figure out whether or not it has a carbon monoxide leak that's dangerous. So if it does rise to the level where it's dangerous, National Fuel will cut the line. Same with National Grid. If you have an electrical issue and it's not between your box and the street, and they find that it's dangerous, they will cut the service. I don't say that to make people feel like they shouldn't contact them. It's just a risk that they should know about if they choose to contact National Fuel or National Grid. But they're only really cutting the service when it's dangerous to leave it on. So if you feel that your heater is acting strangely and emitting a strange smell, I still think calling National Fuel is probably the right call, even if it may result in the gas being turned off until it's fixed, because if they are turning it off, it means it's not safe. So they're going to deal with specific utility issues. The Buffalo Water Department as well can inspect for like certain water issues. Same with the Buffalo Sewer Department. They'll all look at those sorts of things. The two biggest ones that I definitely see tenants dealing with the most are going to be National Fuel or National Grid, A, because the tenant already has a relationship with them because they're paying that bill, and B, those are much more common issues to come across than the water. Oftentimes, the biggest water issue is going to be whether or not the water is turned on, which the water department can let you know if that's something that's going on their end as far as an unpaid bill or something else. If you are watching this and the COVID-19 pandemic is still ongoing, do note that if the water has been turned off due to non-payment, that is not something that's supposed to be happening. I don't know the date as to which that expires, but definitely reach out to Neighborhood Legal Services or the water company, or also I think the Partnership of Public Good has been doing work on that, but reach out to somebody and they can try and assist you with getting the water turned back on if it's been turned off due to non-payment and the pandemic is still ongoing. The other big inspection agency that's out there are going to be the different Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher providers. They do a very different sort of inspection than the building inspector or the health department, where the building inspector and health department are determined by local codes what they're going to be looking for. These are determined by the federal housing quality standards, or what they're called. So for these inspections, they're looking to make sure that apartments are up to par, if a subsidy is going to be paid. So this is only for people who have that subsidy. So if you have a housing choice voucher, or you're new to the housing choice voucher system, you probably have heard about these inspections. You've probably gone through them several times. If you have a voucher, they're annual inspections. They happen on an as-needed basis as well. I would say if you have a housing choice voucher and you're experiencing conditions issues, this should be the first place to turn, because these inspectors, if the inspection fails, have a much stronger enforcement mechanism built into it as opposed to the health department or building inspector. Whereas the health department or building inspector can ultimately take the landlord to housing court. That is a much more slow-moving process than having a housing choice voucher, and if a repair is not done in the time frame set up by that provider, the housing choice voucher payment will not be going out to that landlord, which incentivizes the landlord to get the repairs done. If they don't get the repairs done, they don't get paid. So they look at a much wider swath than the code, I would say. They're pretty intense inspections. They include a lot of things. Unfortunately, like others, they are not going to be testing for mold, but they do have a very wide array of things that they will look for. And like I said, they have that built-in enforcement mechanism. And the way you contact those is if you have a housing choice voucher, you have a housing specialist, that's what you speak to. If you're having issues with that, if things aren't moving along like they should with inspections, you can certainly call our office at 716-847-0650.